why does God ask people to worship him? And this is a very common question that arises in many people's minds and in many people's discussions and circles. You've either had it or heard it or have it or will hear it. And so this paper was inspired by a short, very valuable book by Dr. Sami Amiri that I originally intended on rendering into English with a bit of summarization. But many of the contributors at Yaqeen, may Allah bless them and reward them, offered some valuable insights, maybe even a little bit of repackaging to this question, to become what we think is an ideal little manual on how to grapple with this question whenever it arises. And so originally, though, what Dr. Sami Amiri does is that he mentions how this question, why does God ask people to worship him anyway, really straddles the two questions that many atheistic doubts basically are anchored in. Number one, how do we understand questions that the scientific process cannot really decipher or experiment or test or come to a conclusion on, like the questions on existence, the existential questions. What does our existence really mean? And secondly is grappling with how to understand the unseen, because we don't even have access to begin understanding or examining it to understand it. And so this question actually falls on both of those, right? How do we understand our existence in terms of, is it to worship God? But then why? Why does God want that? And so the second part of the question is, why did God put us here with that objective, with that purpose in our lives, in our existence? And then he goes on to mention that this question, to begin with, reflects many presumptions that the questioner has, which generate this criticism, this objection, certain presumptions about God, for example, that he asks, that must mean that he needs. And so unless we can get past the fact that no, he's not asking because he needs, you'll never move on to try and figure out, all right, why else could he be asking? And so that's one of the inconsistencies, or should I say obstacles, that impedes people from properly finding a good answer for this question. And then after mentioning what's problematic about the question and deconstructing the question, he moves on to giving some very beautiful answers that, though the question is wrong, if you will, here are still some answers for it. And why God does, if he gets nothing out of it, no benefit, and he's not harmed if we don't worship him, then why does he ask? And he gives some beautiful answers on that as well. And I guess the highlight of this paper, and I would appreciate any feedback on it, inshallah, is that it helps a person realize, if reading this with an open mind, with a grain of salt, that's fine as well, that there are so many intellectual barriers, or pseudo-barriers, or pseudo-intellectual barriers, should I say, that actually render us incapable of properly analyzing certain questions of these. And it reminded me of the statement of some of the early Muslims, when, not to dismiss the utility of philosophy altogether, but that sometimes philosophy becomes so convoluted that it's just easier to go without it, if you will. The intelligent person doesn't need to put himself through that. There's a more direct channel to the answer, and the simpleton doesn't understand it. So like either way, it's not really offering much utility sometimes. But it reminded me about some of the early Muslims when they engaged some of these philosophers that kind of had the line blurred between skepticism and cynicism. They would say, I need not, I guess, warp the purity of mind that Allah provided for us when he taught us how to think in the Qur'an, with the likes of these pathways to knowledge, if you will. And so he used to say that I would prefer to die on the pure belief of the elderly woman and the young child, meaning the simpleton, meaning the person who just is quote-unquote dismissed as unintellectual, old-fashioned, or not yet intellectual enough, small, immature child. At times, you may come full circle and realize, oh man, there was a channel of intuition that could have delivered me to these things, and I kind of had veils lowered from being able to access these things as easily as naturally, these sacred truths, these existential truths. And the reason why that was a highlight for me is because after all the vetting of what's wrong with the question and the proper way to answer the question, after all of that was there, you go and you ask your children, why does God ask us to worship him? And they gave me the exact same answers without all of this discussion in the books and from the counter arguments and then within yaqeen and outside yaqeen. And so it shows us that many a times we may be far more culturally conditioned into biases than we may ever realize. And realizing that will be a first step towards minimizing those biases and being able to identify certain very, very necessary truths.